Hi guys, welcome to Little Wicket Railway. I'm Rob and in this video we're looking at the new S&DR Locomotion No.1 from Hornby. I very rarely pre-order models, but as soon as Hornby announced this as part of their 2024 range, I couldn't resist. It's just so different to everything else in my collection, and I love how complex the motion looked in all the engineering samples that Hornby shared during the launch. Also, the price wasn't actually too bad, considering this was a brand new tooling and would have taken quite a bit of design work given how unique it is. Hornby's current RRP is £184.99, but I paid just over £150 at Derails. And credit to Hornby, they've delivered this in good time. Sometimes you can wait years for models to arrive, but in this case it was less than 12 months. It's been out for a few weeks now, and I'm aware there are already quite a few videos from other creators looking at this model. I've generally tried to avoid watching them so that I could remain objective and make my own mind up about it, but I have seen a few things being discussed. For example, I understand that this takes a Next 18 decoder, but the Hornby HM7000 Next 18 doesn't fit, and that installing any decoder can be quite difficult. I will be fitting a decoder to mine, so it'll be interesting to see what that's like. Right, I'll get this opened and take some photos, and whilst I'm doing that, here's some history about the real thing.
Locomotion No.1 was built in 1825 by George and Robert Stephenson, and it ran on the Stockton and Darlington Railway in the northeast of England. It was the first steam engine to pull a passenger train on a public railway, and this marked a groundbreaking moment in transportation history. The locomotive had two vertical cylinders, and whilst not particularly innovative in many ways, it was one of the first locomotives to use connecting rods to reduce wheel slippage. It had a top speed of around 15 miles per hour, and it operated at the S&DR for 3 years before it was heavily damaged by a boiler explosion which also killed the driver. It was rebuilt but only remained at the railway until 1850, after which it was converted into a stationary engine. Locomotion No.1 was also one of the first locomotives to be preserved though, purchased and restored in 1856 by Joseph Pease. It's been displayed in various locations over the years and is currently owned by the National Railway Museum. Because the original locomotive is too fragile to return to steam, a replica was built in 1975, and that was recently purchased by Darlington Borough Council ahead of their 200th anniversary celebrations for the Stockton and Darlington Railway. So that's the real thing, now back to the model. The packaging for the model is quite smart, and inside you get this special card with a bit of information about Locomotion No.1 and a brief history. And it's worth noting that this model is Era 11, so it represents the locomotive as it appears today in its preserved state. Underneath the card we've got some quite dense foam surrounding the model, which is also secured in place by a block of clear plastic. The model looks very fragile, so it's good to see that Hornby have made a real effort to keep it safe. A pretty standard Hornby instruction leaflet is included, which covers lubrication, accessories, how to remove the model from the protective casing, and also how to install a decoder. I suppose the information card and the A4 sheet get the job done, but other manufacturers have been doing much better at this sort of thing. They produce full glossy owner's manuals now, and that contains all the history and information about the model, along with colour photos. And given how special this model is, it would have been great if Hornby could have done something similar. There's an accessories bag, and in here you get a selection of couplings, the horrible Hornby style ones to connect their Era 1 stock, an option with an NEM adapter, and a version with a magnet suitable for the Accurascale children wagons. Also in the bag are a couple of figures, a driver and a fireman, painted up in period style clothing. Clearly recreationist though, given that this is Era 11, but a nice touch nonetheless. To remove the loco from the protective case, you need to take out this screw, which is holding the loco onto the base. Then you're free to lift it out, but be careful because this model is tiny and it's covered with fragile, delicate parts. The wood effect used on the planks around the boiler and for the tender looks really nice. And the rest of the model is generally black cast iron, which also looks pretty good. And despite its small size, Hornby packed quite a bit of detail onto it. Loads of rivet detail, particularly around the chimney, and then we've got this bell at the front. There's the locomotion nameplate, and we've got this seat for the driver on the side of the boiler. There's what looks to be a gauge on this side, but I don't think it is actually a gauge, it's something to do with the operation of the engine. The main feature on this model is the motion, which connects the two vertical cylinders that poke through at either end of the boiler to the wheels. The complexity of this at 00 scale is really very impressive, and I can't wait to see it all moving. Most of it is painted up in a silvery metallic colour, but a couple of parts haven't been painted, they've just been left grey, and it does look a little bit plasticky. The design on the wheels is quite intricate and is an accurate representation of the current preserved locomotive. The firebox area isn't particularly detailed, but we do have what look to be a couple of separately painted up taps. The tender is connected to the engine with a fixed drawbar, which is quite fine, but then underneath we've got 4 separate wires, which are chunky given the size of the model, and it's a pretty messy solution when it comes to an electrical connection, and it's disappointing that Hornby couldn't come up with anything more innovative here. On the tender, we've got a couple of tiny steps on either side and a sloping coal load in the middle, with the water being stored in the box above it. Again, the rivet detail here looks lovely all over this area. And running down from the water box on one side, there's this black pipe with what looks to be a tap on the end. And hooked on the back, we've got an early form of tail lamp, which apparently would have contained some glowing or burning material, but be careful because it seems to ping off at every opportunity. Once removed, the couplings from the accessories pack can be added on here. Either side of the coupling, we've got some very small dumb buffers. Underneath, we get another better look at those ugly wires that connect the engine and the tender, but we can also see the pickups that Hornby have chosen to use. I had assumed that this model, given its size, would have pickups on all wheels, but because Hornby have used this spring-style pickup that wraps around the axles, effectively, only half the wheels have pickups on them, and I really hope this doesn't cause problems later. Both axles on the engine have gears attached to them, driven by a 3-pole motor. So that's an overview of the model, and before I fitted a decoder, I wanted to see how it ran on analog, so I set it up on the rolling road just to make sure everything moved as it should. It's set up here on the rolling road with my basic Hornby analog controller connected, and after some initial reluctance to get going, clearly a few areas that needed to come unstuck, it was off and running. All those moving parts do look incredible. It's a fantastic piece of engineering in scale form. I left it to have a little run in and everything seemed to be moving freely. So it runs pretty well on analog. Let's install a decoder. And I've got this basic Hatton's Next 18 decoder here, and the instructions say that it's as simple as removing a single screw to access the socket, and also under here we've got a pre-fitted speaker, which is a nice touch from Hornby. The instructions suggest holding the model in the plastic casing if you're going to do work on the underside of it. So that's what I've done here, and there's the hole, presumably at the bottom of which there's the screw that we need to remove. Because the screw is seated so deep, you need a very thin screwdriver to reach it. Not everyone is going to have a screwdriver like this to hand, so I think Hornby should have provided one. I'm using one that came with a super cheap set of battery boxes, so they're really not that expensive. The back then just comes away to reveal the speaker, and underneath is the blanking plate for the socket, which we need to remove. Originally, Hornby advertised that this model would take their Next 18 HM7000 decoder. Here's a screenshot of the marketing, but subsequently they've discovered their HM7000 decoder doesn't fit because the Bluetooth element makes it too large. Quite disappointing, but I don't think Hornby have plans to release a Locomotion No.1 sound profile anyway. It's not on the current list, so if you want sound, then HM7000 probably wasn't the best option anyway. Fitting this Hatton's decoder was pretty tricky. The solder joints where the speaker is connected to the PCB are quite large. They stick up and prevent the decoder from being well seated. As you can see here, I did manage to get the decoder to stay in eventually and give it a little test, and everything was running pretty well. So I set about putting the model back together. Then I tested it again and nothing happened. Clearly the decoder had come dislodged whilst reassembling, so I took it apart again and tried to get the decoder to stay in place. I resorted to removing the plastic shrink wrap around the decoder, which I don't like doing because it's generally there for a reason, but I didn't see any risk of exposed components coming into contact with anything on this model. Hornby have put a little bit of tape over the speaker connections, so we shouldn't have any issues as long as that stays there. I wondered if the Hatton's decoder was unusually large, but it's actually smaller than the blanking plate. Having removed the wrap, I did eventually manage to get the decoder to stay in place, although I'm not convinced it's correctly seated. I think this is a fundamental design flaw from Hornby. Fitting a decoder should be the easiest thing in the world these days. It's not new technology. Hornby have been working with digital decoders since 1979. They should be able to design a decoder socket by now. The Class 87 I looked at recently had a design issue with the decoder socket, and this one does too. Rumour has it that Hornby are looking at reducing the size of their HM7000 decoders for future versions. I did email Hornby tech support to ask which decoder they recommended, and this is the response that I received. As the HM7000 decoders are dual mode, DCC, BLE, there is a limitation to how small we can make the decoder. With a model like Locomotion, it is impossible to make a BLE decoder small enough to fit in the model. Hence why this model is not advertised HM7000 compatible. We may in the future develop a decoder small enough to fit in this model, but it will not be Bluetooth. Our recommended decoder for this model is a Zimo MN180N18 or an MS590N18. Generally, I'm not impressed with the electrical side of this model. Anyway, back on the rolling road, and this time the decoder had stayed in place and it did work, and I have to say that it does run very well for me on DCC, so it was time to get it on the layout and see how it performed. I started with Locomotion on its own, and this was the result. Incredibly jerky, intermittent running. Given that it ran fine on the rolling road and was still attempting to move, I just assumed it was not liking my track. I run stuff around here all the time without issue, but I gave the track a really deep clean with the rubber and IPA, and that made a huge difference, but the model would still cut out at times. And that's the problem with only having 4 pickups. On a small light model like this, you've got 8 wheels, you should really have 8 pickups for reliable operation. This model would really benefit from a stay alive, but fitting one would be really difficult. But at least with freshly cleaned track, the model was moving, so I thought I'd add in some coaches. But before we get into the running session, it's time for another rant. These plastic Hornby Era 1 couplings are a pile of dog shit. They're not new for Locomotion No.1, they've been around since Rocket was released, but the coupling hook that comes with the Locomotion No.1 model to connect it to the Hornby Era 1 coaches is a really tight fit and a nightmare to get on. I was focused on not damaging the motion, and I neglected the pipe that runs down the side of the tender, and it pinged off. The plastic used for this part seems really brittle, and I suspect I'm not the only person who this has happened to. But back to the couplings, and they take all the fun out of running these models. They're such a terrible design. They take absolutely ages to couple together, but come off incredibly easily. A single derailment means that you'll probably need to do the whole rake again. I'm actually furious at the person or team who signed off on this rubbish. Anyway, I did manage to get a short rake of coaches together, and here they are running most of the way around the layout. I say most of the way because I think I actually only got one single complete loop without some kind of stall or uncoupling incident. They're also going a lot faster than I would have liked, but 50% speed on the controller meant there was less chance of it stopping. So, what do we think? Well, it's a beautiful model. Loads of detail, and Hornby should be incredibly proud with how they've created the intricate motion, such tiny, complex moving parts. It all looks brilliant. It's nice that they've included the crew, thoughtful that they've got couplings that are compatible with other manufacturers' products, and it's really good that a speaker is pre-fitted, although I've not been able to test it out, so who knows what the sound quality is like. The price is also pretty reasonable in my opinion. Just over £150 from the retailers for something this unique and intricate is fine by me. And once you get it running, I found it to be very smooth with nice slow speed control on both digital and analog. However, the visual and mechanical success is massively overshadowed by the poor electrical design on this model. The pickups are insufficient, which means that it will struggle with point work, crossovers, and track that is anything less than freshly cleaned. Hornby could so easily have doubled the pickups on this model to make it more reliable. The wiring between the tender and engine is large, messy and ugly. Bachmann have shown that small wires can be used discreetly, as they've done on the Wicket trolley, so it is possible. Finally, the decoder socket not being compatible with their new HM7000 decoder offering is really poor. And it's hard to fit other manufacturers' decoders because the speaker connections don't allow them to sit flat. Not a problem for the analog users, but for us digital fans, incredibly frustrating. So there we are, the Hornby Locomotion No.1. Recently, Hornby have been listening to feedback, revising models and re-releasing them with minor improvements. They did this with the APT, and I believe they've done something with the Black 5. Locomotion No.1 is a prime candidate for this. They don't need to adjust the body or the mechanical side of things. Just change to wiper pickups on the engine, use a smaller gauge wire with a retaining clip between the engine and tender, and adjust the location of the speaker connections so that decoders can lie flat. Given that the initial run pretty much sold out immediately, Hornby could definitely re-release an improved version, and I'm pretty sure it would sell. Final conclusion on the version I've got though is that it looks beautiful, but it's no fun to actually play with. It's best left in the display cabinet. That's about it for this video. If you enjoyed it, then please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Special thanks to all the YouTube members and patrons for your support. It's very much appreciated, and your names are up on the screen now. If I can find any affiliate links, then I'll put them in the video description below. Thanks for watching, and I will hopefully see you again soon.